All right, let's jump into another deep dive, you guys.
Okay.
Today we're going to be taking a look at moral value.
Oh, interesting.
And we are using an excerpt of a transcript that comes from the Ask Yourself YouTube channel.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Have you seen that channel?
Oh, yeah, I love that channel.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, so you're probably familiar then with the whole concept of, name the trait.
Yeah, name the trait. Love that.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah. So, I mean, for those who aren't familiar, could you just give like a really quick overview of that?
Sure. So basically, name the trait is kind of it's presented as a thought experiment, but it's also a dialogue process.
Right.
And it's designed to kind of tease out inconsistencies in people's ethical thinking.
Okay.
And a lot of times the target of this is speciesism.
Okay. And so the idea that humans are inherently morally superior to other animals
right.
just by virtue of being human. Gotcha. Okay. So the core of this this process, this thought experiment, is that, we kind of pose the question of like, okay, so let's say we're going to just like gradually change.
Equalize the traits.
The traits of...
between a human and an animal.
A human and an animal, right?
Yeah.
And at what point does that being lose its moral value?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's funny because I feel like intuitively I just want to say like, never. Humans are always going to have moral value no matter how many traits you swap out.
It's interesting, though, because it forces you to kind of confront the reasoning behind that.
Yeah.
Like, what is it about being human that grants you this kind of, like, moral immunity?
Moral immunity, exactly. And so that's kind of the point of this whole thing, is to sort of expose those potentially flawed assumptions, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where the dialogue part really comes into play because,
right.
The video presents it as like a conversation. You're talking to somebody and you're, trying to figure out where their
inconsistencies lie.
Exactly.
Okay, so walk us through, like, I mean, if you were to have this conversation with somebody, where would you even begin?
Well, it starts with a very simple question.
Okay.
During this process of, like, gradually making the human more and more like the animal,
right,
does that being lose its moral value?
Okay, simple enough.
And there are two possible answers.
Okay.
Yes or no.
Yeah.
If they say no,
then
the being never loses its moral value.
Never loses it.
Then the conversation continues.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. You're saying that humans have this special moral status that animals don't have.
Right.
But you're also saying that there's no point at which a human loses that status, even when becoming more like an animal.
Okay.
So what is it about being human that's so special?
Right. Yeah. It seems like a little bit of
it's a contradiction.
A contradiction.
So the video actually refers to this as like the logic check. Okay.
You're checking the logic of the person's position.
Gotcha.
And trying to see if it holds up.
Yeah. So if they're saying like, oh, humans are special, animals aren't, but they can't actually point to what makes humans special then.
Right. And they're saying it doesn't matter how much like an animal a human becomes, they still retain that specialness.
Right.
Then it becomes very difficult to justify that position.
Right. It does. Okay. So then let's say they say yes.
Okay.
What happens then?
If they say yes, that moral value is lost somewhere along the way.
Right.
Then we have another question.
Okay.
Do you know which specific trait marks the loss of moral value?
Okay.
And here's where things get even more tricky.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if they say no, I don't know which trait.
Right.
Then it raises a really interesting problem.
Okay.
It means that they're essentially admitting uncertainty about the moral status of any being.
Right.
That falls between a human and the animal you're comparing them to.
Okay. Yeah. So then you have like a whole spectrum of like
weird hybrid creatures.
Yeah. The video gives some really vivid examples. Like, imagine a human with a cow's tail. Would that being still have moral value?
I mean, I think so.
Right.
Like a tail doesn't seem like a big...
Yeah, but most people would say yes.
Yeah.
Okay, what about a human with a cow's eye?
Okay, still.
Now we're getting a little more...
Yeah, a little creepier.
Unsettling.
Yeah.
But would that being still deserve moral consideration?
I mean, I would still say yes.
Right.
I don't...
So if it's not the tail or the eye...
Then what is it?
What is it?
Yeah.
And that's exactly the point. It's trying to show you that...
This line is arbitrary.
It's very difficult to draw a hard line between humans and animals and say, okay, here's where moral value begins and here's where it ends.
Right, because when you think about it, it is really this blurry
It's a spectrum.
It's a spectrum, yeah.
And this thought experiment is kind of pushing us to confront that spectrum.
Right, and to really think about what are those criteria that we're using and if they really hold up.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's what happens if they say they don't know the trait.
Yeah.
But what if they say they do?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Oh, man. All right, well, I can't wait to see what happens.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be back.
Okay. Okay, so where were we?
We left off with, what happens if someone says they do know the trait?
Oh, right. So they're like, yeah, I know exactly what makes humans special. You know, what sets them apart.
Yeah, like they think they've got the golden ticket,
They found the magic ingredient.
Exactly.
Secret sauce.
Secret sauce of moral value.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens then? Do we just, take their word for it?
Not quite.
Okay.
The name the trait process, it doesn't just stop there.
Okay.
It actually challenges that named trait.
Okay.
With what we call a reductio ad absurdum.
Okay, now I remember we talked about this a little bit earlier, but just as a refresher.
Yeah.
What exactly is a reductio ad absurdum?
So it's basically a fancy way of saying we're going to take your idea
and
we're going to push it to its logical extreme.
Okay.
We're going to see what happens if we really follow this line of reasoning all the way down the rabbit hole.
Okay, so it's kind of like we're calling their bluff a little bit. Like, okay, you think this is the end-all be-all
right, exactly.
of moral value. Let's see where that takes us.
Yeah, let's see what the implications are.
Okay, I like it.
And if following that logic leads us to a conclusion that's totally bonkers or just morally unacceptable,
yeah,
then it kind of suggests that maybe the original idea wasn't so great.
Right, like maybe we need to rethink this a little bit.
Exactly.
Okay, so can you give us a concrete example of how this would work in practice?
Sure. Let's say someone says rationality.
Okay.
That's the key trait. That's what separates humans from animals and gives us moral value.
So they're saying, you have to be able to think rationally to be worthy of moral consideration.
Exactly. Any being that isn't capable of rational thought is somehow lacking in moral value.
Okay, so then how would we apply what was it, reductio ad?
Reductio absurdum.
Reductio ad absurdum.
Okay.
How would we apply that to this particular trait?
Well, we could ask, okay, so if lack of rationality means it's okay to treat someone differently,
okay,
does that mean it's okay to treat infants differently because they haven't fully developed their rational faculties?
Okay.
What about people with severe cognitive impairments?
Oh, yeah.
Would it be okay to treat them differently, to say that their lives are less valuable?
Yeah, I mean, intuitively, I think most people would say, no, that's not right. That's not okay.
Exactly. And that's the power of the reductio. It highlights these potential consequences of a belief, and it forces the person to really confront, okay, am I really comfortable with this?
Yeah, do I really want to go down that road? Exactly. Okay, so they've been hit with this reductio ad absurdum. What happens next?
Well, there are a couple of possibilities. They might try to backpedal a little bit and say, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way. I didn't mean infants or people with disabilities. I just meant, animals are different.
So they're kind of trying to
They're trying to carve out exceptions to their rule, which kind of undermines the whole idea.
Right, because if the trait is so important, but then you're making all these exceptions, then...
Right, then it's not really the defining characteristic.
It's not really the thing, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's one possibility. What's the other one?
The other possibility, and this is where things get really interesting, is they might double down and say, yeah, you know what, I stand by that conclusion, even if it sounds extreme.
Okay.
That's where you really start to see the underlying values that are driving their beliefs.
So it's not really about winning the argument or proving them wrong. It's more about...
It's kind of revealing.
It's about understanding where they're coming from.
Yeah. Okay, so this is all very conceptual.
Yeah.
Right? But I remember the Name the Trait video actually has this really cool visual component to it.
Oh, yes. The trait swapping animation.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So remember those two circles we talked about before?
Okay, one for the human and one for the...
One for the human, one for the animal.
Right.
And each circle contains various traits.
Okay.
Some of them are overlapping, representing the shared traits between humans and animals.
Right.
And some of them are unique to each species.
Okay.
Now imagine that you can start shifting traits from one circle to the other.
Okay.
You can literally see the human becoming more and more like the animal.
And so I guess the idea is as you're moving these traits those overlapping areas are getting...
Exactly. They're expanding.
Okay.
And it really drives home the point that
right.
the dividing line between us and other animals
is not as clear-cut.
It's not so simple
as we might like to think.
Right.
And so it's this visual representation of that trait equalization process that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, it's a nice way to kind of like see it happening.
Exactly.
Rather than just like thinking about it abstractly.
It makes it more tangible, more concrete.
Okay, so we've got the logic, we've got the dialogue, and now we've got this visual element as well.
Yeah, it's a very comprehensive approach.
It really is.
To this very complex issue.
So as we're kind of wrapping up this part of the discussion, what are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that name the trait is really a tool for critical thinking. Right. It's not about, winning an argument.
It's not about gotcha.
It's about pushing ourselves to really articulate the reasons behind our beliefs.
Right.
And to examine those beliefs.
For inconsistency.
For inconsistencies, exactly.
So it's kind of like taking a step back from our own intuition and saying, okay, why do I believe this?
Why do I hold this moral position?
And does it actually hold up when I really start to...
Under scrutiny.
Under scrutiny, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Anything else we should be taking away from this?
I would also say, don't be afraid of the discomfort.
Okay.
These are tough questions.
They are.
And grappling with them is bound to lead to some, unsettling realizations.
Yeah, I've definitely felt a little bit of that during this conversation.
Yeah, and that's okay. That's a good sign.
It means we're thinking.
It means we're growing.
Okay.
It means we're engaging with these ideas on a deeper level.
Okay, so lean into the discomfort.
Lean into the discomfort.
All right, I like it.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the other implications that this whole name the trait thing raises? It's funny because we've been talking about, like humans becoming more like animals.
Right.
But it almost feels like we haven't really defined, what is moral value?
Yeah. That's a great point. It's kind of like we've been dancing around this concept without really pinning it down.
Yeah. And this whole deep dive has really gotten me thinking about, where do I draw the line?
Right.
And do my lines even make sense?
I think that's the real power of a thought experiment, name the trait.
Yeah.
It's not about providing a definitive answer.
Right.
It's about prompting these kinds of questions and getting us to really scrutinize our own beliefs.
I think that's why I'm kind of my brain is going in all these different directions now.
Sure.
Because the video focuses specifically on humans and animals.
Right.
But I can't help but wonder if this whole name the trait process could apply to other
ethical dilemmas.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What about...
I mean, the specific example might change.
Right.
But the underlying principle remains the same.
Okay.
You're still asking what criteria are we using to determine moral worth?
Right.
And do those criteria hold up?
When we really put them under the microscope.
So, for example, what about artificial intelligence?
Oh, that's a great one.
Right. As AI becomes more and more sophisticated, this question of moral status is going to be front and center.
Absolutely. And I think name the trait could be a really interesting framework for thinking about that.
So imagine applying it to AI.
Yeah.
If we could gradually enhance the capabilities of an AI system.
Right.
At what point would we say, okay, this now deserves moral consideration?
Right. What's the threshold?
What's the threshold? Yeah.
Is it self-awareness?
Is it the ability to feel emotions?
Right.
Or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, and it forces us to confront this really fundamental question of what does it even mean to be worthy of moral consideration?
Right. Is it just that you're made of flesh and blood?
Right. Is it purely biological?
Or is it something more than that?
Yeah.
And it's not just AI. I was thinking, too, we could even use this to kind of look back at history.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Right. And think about all the ways that different groups of humans have been denied basic rights.
Right. Based on arbitrary criteria.
Exactly. Based on whatever trait was convenient at the time.
Yeah.
And so how do we make sure that we're not making those same mistakes?
Right.
But in the future?
It's like using name the trait as a lens to examine the past.
And present.
Yeah.
Wow. This has been, I feel like my brain is a little fried.
It's a lot to take in.
It is a lot to take in. But I think this has been really productive.
I agree.
So as we're kind of wrapping up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think first and foremost, just remember that name the trait is a tool.
Okay.
It's a tool for critical thinking.
Yeah.
It's not about proving someone wrong or winning a debate.
Right. It's about like having that internal...
Exactly. It's about self-reflection.
Yeah.
It's about really understanding the reasons behind your own moral judgment.
Okay, so examine those beliefs. Don't just like...
Yeah. Don't just accept them at face value.
Yep, okay.
And second, embrace the discomfort.
Okay.
These are tough questions.
They are, like we've been saying.
And they lead to some, like, kind of scary places sometimes.
Yeah. But that discomfort is a sign of growth.
Okay.
It means you're really engaging with these ideas on a deeper level.
So lean into the discomfort.
Lean into it, yeah.
All right, I like it.
And finally, don't be afraid to have those difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Talk to people who hold different viewpoints than you.
Yeah.
Name the trait as a framework for respectful dialogue and exploration.
Right. It's not about, like, yelling at each other.
Exactly.
It's about really, like, trying to... Understand.
Yeah.
Okay, so to our listeners, we leave you with this. What are your criteria for moral value?
Good question.
And how would name the trait challenge those criteria?
Take some time to think about it.
Yeah. Maybe even try the process out.
Yeah.
With a friend or a colleague.
It's a good dinner table conversation.
It is. Yeah. You never know what insights might emerge.
Well, this has been another great deep dive.
I agree.
Thanks to everyone for listening.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.